Welcome everybody to Jeanne and the Clocktower. Jeanne at the Clocktower, I should say. And the French underneath it, Jeanne à la tour horloge. It's the same thing, just in French. This is by Manga Gamer. Well, it's published by Manga Gamer, who provided me with a key. This is made by Liarsoft, who made Kindred Spirits on the Roof and Goxen of the Golden Lightning, which is a pretty good game. I played a little bit of it. I never finished it, but from what I played, I liked it. And I'm a huge Jeanne d'Arc fan, so I'm really excited. There is an intro. I can't show it because there's nudity, sexual content. So, you know, there's that. It's $39.99 on Steam, and it's also on the Manga Gamer store. And I think Liarsoft has a store of their own too, but maybe mistaken. But yeah, let's get right into it. Oh, wait, hang on, check the config. There's our options. Yay. Let's get into it. This game came out a bit ago, and I've just gotten back into YouTube, so I'm a little bit delayed on a lot of this stuff, so this game kind of came and went. But you know what? That's perfectly fine. It's not a race. Configuration menu. Yes, okay. Yeah, we know how to do all that stuff. It's pretty easy. June 6th, 12:15 a.m. The silence of the moonlit night was suddenly broken. Searchlights on the ground exposed the position of the formation of C-47 Dakota transport planes. Awakened by the shrill blaring of the siren, the anti-aircraft gun formation roared, unleashing a storm of countless lethal iron rounds into the dark of night. From the surface, it would seem like ink droplets traveling over the water's surface, but to those traveling through the skies, it was a lethal cluster of malice and death. Before long, a single anti-air round burst at point-blank range from the formation. One unfortunate unit was pelted and rattled by those fragments. With its right wing shot through, the aircraft's nose lowered as it began losing height. The damaged unit's pilots desperately struggled to maintain altitude, but was mercilessly rushed with lines of orange fire as if to make it clear he would not be allowed to escape. Seizure warning. The anti-aircraft machine guns howled in their intent to tear through helpless prey to shreds. Flares, bombs, and countless more bullets the eye couldn't perceive were fired from all directions, forming a lethal net around the airplane. Their plane jolted violently as it grazed against several more lines of fire. Experienced as they were, even the paratroopers resting against the passenger compartment as they waited to descend were losing their composure. Hang on one second. I am going to turn down the audio. The music is a little loud. Where's the audio at? Turn on sound effects too. Let's try that. That's a little better. The two youngest of the unit, a red-haired young man and a blue-haired young man, had exchanged words as they gazed outside through the window. Their half-destroyed main wings, suspended engine that billowed black smoke in the craft's wake, and the enemy fire rushing in was the only one thing they didn't want to happen. More machine gun fire brushed against them, causing the fuselage to rock even more violently and incline even further downward. The two turned around and, like the rest of their unit, gazed at the communication door at the front of the plane, hoping that instructions would arrive from the cockpit as soon as possible. The battlefield was a place where a single lapse in judgment, a brief moment's delay, was all that separated a soldier's life and death. Before long, the door opened, and the officer leading their company revealed himself. Oh boy. The company commander, giving his orders swiftly, began explaining the situation. The troops got to their feet before the commander even concluded his words and began preparing for descent in the experienced manner of trained paratroopers. Oh. She got shot! The next moment, several anti-aircraft machine guns rounds penetrated the plane's armor. The commander took a direct hit, and the other troops that had risen to their feet were mowed down one by one by the ricocheting bullets, dropping like dominoes. A hole that looked like the maw of a wild beast had opened in the airframe's wall, the wind blowing in viciously through it. Having been shot several more times, the fuselage lurched forward even more, dropping faster and faster. The two young soldiers, who had been lucky to evade the ricocheting rounds, crawled along the inclining floor and reached the rear descent hatch. The ashen-haired young soldier called out to the red-headed one behind him as he set his parachute's static line cable and jumped out into the air. We can't die now, we have portraits. The red-haired young soldier called. Roland soon followed suit, casting himself out into the night. I don't think they made it. The aircraft burst apart just as Roland took to the skies. With the blast's intense shockwave at his back and as he felt the nape of his neck get scorched by the heat, Roland patiently waited for his parachute to open above him. Normally, the static line they attached while waiting in the plane was set to open their parachutes after falling a set distance. But since the plane blew up as soon as they jumped out, it didn't function properly. That's not good. Roland instantly tried pulling the emergency manual cord, attempting to open the parachute himself. Did it work? Okay, it worked. Slowly falling. And a few seconds later, it unfurled safely above his head and began fluttering gently through the wind. Roland sighed of relief, having narrowly evaded certain death. See, I can never do skydiving or anything like that. Parachute won't open, and then I die. With the bright moon on his back, its silhouette began drifting downward like a jellyfish floating through the sea. Craning his neck, Roland spotted the ashen-haired soldier Oliver holding a thumb up from above him. Since his parachute had opened late, Roland seemed to have overtaken Oliver, despite him going first. Oliver was smiling with relief, but both of them were aware that they were in no way out of the woods yet. After all, there's people down there that want to kill us. Barrages of anti-air fire aiming at the other transports in the sky and parachuting soldiers filled the air. Roland gulped as he watched those parabolas of light intersect, forming what, in the darkness, looked like almost a solid dome made out of cane. That's an interesting way to put it. But luckily, or perhaps unfortunately so, the wind from the sea blew them gradually away from the machine gun's destructive range. That only meant they were getting further and further away from the designated landing point. The two exchanged hand gestures and eye signals as they operated their cords on their parachutes to try and adjust their touchdown point, but the strong wind rendered their efforts pointless. The parachutes carried them away from the urban area against their will and into a forested region far to the west. Hopefully there's no soldiers over there. Oh. Neighbors are home. Beautiful night. Oh, not a beautiful night anymore. All of a sudden, the light of the sky peeking in through the trees was dyed crimson, a much more intense shade of red even than London skies during the air raids. Boarding over the canopy, as scarlet as it had been smeared in bloodshed of countless battlefields, was a black orb like the pupil of a departed soldier. It was hard to immediately grasp, but that was actually the moon. Sitting enshrined in the sky, reminiscent of a sea of blood, that unrealistic black moon that felt as if it had been clipped out of a negative photograph glared down at them. Under sky and moon dyed in phantasmagoric colors, two young soldiers who parachuted into the forest ran as though their lives depended on it. Copious amounts of thick fog rolled in between the gaps in the trees, depriving both of them their vision and sense of direction, making their impatience and fatigue all the more pronounced. Roland turned around, waving his hands to signal his whereabouts to his comrade, who was about to get lost in the fog. Two young men clad in camouflage, with badges bearing the Cross of Lorraine, marking them as members of the Free French Forces, hood berets and shouldering M1928 submachine guns, were pale and confused. One cause for their panic was the unnatural sight spread out above them, but the other cause were the people chasing after them. That's hoarse. The high-pitched voice of a woman's order echoed from behind them, tearing through the permeating silence of the encroaching darkness. This was then followed by the violent sounds of multiple sets of hooves kicking against the ground and the ferocious neighing of horses. Soon after they touched down, the young soldiers wandered to the forest safely after landing, and were suddenly met with this raid from within the darkness. They reflexively tried to shoot them down with their guns, but the Cavaliers unflinchingly continued their pursuit. And as the two fled from the Cavaliers, the twilight forest changed its colors around them, as if the color had dripped down from the sky, dyeing the surroundings a more ominous shade of red. Despite how dense the vegetation of the forest was, their mysterious pursuers' speed seemed unhindered as they gradually closed in on the two. Realizing that multiple shadows had overtaken them, cutting off their avenue of escape, Roland and Oliver finally stopped in their tracks. This might be the end of our two heroes. The cavalry noticed their targets had given up on running and switched from a gallop to a canter to a trot, gradually lowering their speed as they circled around them. Their silhouettes dancing around the two from within the thin curtain of fog looked almost like a merry-go-round. They too stood back to back as they fixed their muzzles on the cavaliers menacingly, though both of them doubted if the gesture even carried any meaning. Second, turn that down a bit. There it goes. Let's try that. The voice that spoke to them from the darkness was that of a woman, speaking in a tone so bewitching it was nearly suffocating. Faster than reverberations of that voice could disappear into the trees, a black figure on horseback stepped from the fog, lightly lit by the crimson sky, approaching them with an air of composure. He was clad in an antiquaristic outfit that seemed as though it was taken straight out of a film based around the Middle Ages. Wearing an antiquated black dress, this lady on horseback elegantly held tight onto her black steed's reins. The lower section of her dress, which exposed her pale skin, was adorned with large blooming roses, and both of her slender limbs and forehead were covered in ebony armor. I feel like the armor is kind of pointless when you have a giant weak point that is your chest area. In her right hand was the golden hilt of a sword with a peculiar diagonal tip. The blade's surface was moistened from the fog, granting a crisp glint. This black-clad female knight seemed to seep from within with a lascivious luster, but at the same emanated a sharp, murderous malice. There were still a few cavaliers employed for reconnaissance by Poland and Italy, as General too, by the way. But the Chaucers had all perished back in the Great War. So people weren't really riding horseback, very often. What's more, no female officer would prance around in an outfit this conspicuous. Looking down on the two from her saddle, the black-clad lady displayed a smile tinged with a strange beauty. Hers was an innocent tone, like a cat toying with prey caught in its paws. She showed not a trace of fear at the guns in their hands. Imagining nobles going on a hunting trip when, for 4 straight years now, Europe had been torn apart in a bloody conflict between the Allied forces and the Axis countries, and hunting humans for sport, that was unimaginable. Wait, which one of us is the fox, and which one's the boar? The female knight chuckled as one of the cavaliers behind her let out a low, eerie, scornful laugh from behind his helmet. The cavaliers surrounding them from a distance seemed even stranger than the woman who was apparently leading them. They were uniformly clad in black armor that concealed their features, but from Roland's perspective, they looked like vague, unclear shadows. Their black forms wavered like a mirage, their contours demarcated by a pale phosphorescence. The inside of their helmets looked like it was inhabited by a ghost of some sort, with a pair of red glowing eyes glaring from within them. Between their appearance, the sensation of their presence, and their unnatural voices, not one of them felt as though they were actually there. The wild hunt. Roland wasn't familiar with the term, but still intuitively realized he had encountered something utterly otherworldly. Incapable of facing these uncanny existence any longer, Olivier cussed as he squeezed the trigger. His submachine gun spat out fire, mowing down the shadows surrounding them. Or so it seemed, for while the bullets did reach them, not a drop of blood splashed out, nor did the spark of metal against metal resound. Instead, the rounds disappeared in puffs of smoke, reminiscent of the evaporation of dry ice. Earlier, they had reflexively fired at the Cavaliers when they were first ambushed, but their shots still apparently had no effect. He'd considered that they may have missed since they were in a state of confusion, but when they saw the bullets hit the enemy to no avail, he had no choice but to admit it. Does she not know what a gun is? But the black female knight's composed smile didn't waver in the slightest. On the contrary, she maneuvered her horse a step closer and then another, eventually stopping right before them. Olivier fired at the female knight this time, but the barrage was as ineffective as the one before it. It's not working. As if an invisible wall has been set up around the woman, the machine gun bolts evaporated into black smoke before touching her. Olivier grimaced, having depleted his ammo in the blink of an eye. Probably should have saved some of that. But even if he had any bullets, well, I guess it's a life or death situation, right? Just use what you have. I mean, if you had any bullets left, that would have really been better off. They aren't doing anything anyway. Spurred by habits he picked up in his military training, Roland fixed his sights on the enemy, but he'd already realized that it was a meaningless gesture. Even as they ruthlessly made such a declaration, her captivating lips drew Roland's gaze and attention. The frozen air hanging between them was disturbed as her horse moved in on them. Roland stood sewn into place as if entranced, merely watching detachedly as death made flesh strode toward him. Olivier tossed his now useless gun and lunged at the woman as if trying to knock her off her horse. She swung her sword down at Olivier's head, but since he was running to tackle her, he didn't have a chance to evade. Seeing Olivier rush forward undid whatever paralysis had overtaken Roland, who kicked the ground and took off after his friend in the very next moment. Roland rammed himself into Oliver's back just before he was about to be cut in half, knocking him down to the ground. The blade drew a silvery arc through the air, having lost its mark, but still scattering a few strands of Roland's red hair about. The female knight scoffed and turned the tip of her blade on a flowing horizontal slash. Hitting its mark, the blade cut through Roland's windpipe in a flash. Oh, he's gone. With his carotid artery severed. Blood gushed out like a geyser from his neck without a moment's delay. That's gotta be one of the worst ways to die, though. That's hardly peaceful. Swinging her sword, which has not been dirtied with a single drop of blood, she drew the sign of the cross, and muttered those words as if they were scripture read in some exaggerated ritual. Even with his windpipe slashed, Roland didn't feel any pain, oddly enough. He simply helplessly crumbled to the ground, his body devoid of all strength, as if someone had cut the strings holding him up, like a marionette. As he landed, Roland's field of vision became tinged with red. His own spilled blood and the crimson shades of the sky mingled together, washing over his world. Olivia rose to his feet and rushed to his side. But contrary to what Roland saw, the sound of his voice and footsteps only seemed to be getting further away. And it wasn't just sound, all his senses were rapidly abandoning him. The sensation of the ground, the scent of the forest, the coldness of the wind, and even the taste of blood spreading in his mouth. The silent, still cage of the world was slowly converging and closing in, with Roland at its center. In the center of his narrowing field of vision, the silent black moon gazed down upon him. And after a moment of feeling as though he was floating, as if he'd been sucked into that black eye, his consciousness sank into an endlessly deep abyss. Alright, that's the game. I'm just kidding. There's a lot more game. It's $40. There better be a lot more game. After sinking for some time into the endlessly dark and deep abyss, Roland suddenly felt as if his body was rising to the surface. Feeling faint light against his closed eyelids, he stirred and let out a gasp of air. Clear, cool air soon entered his lungs in place of what he had exhaled. His ears caught the rustling of grass and the faint trickle of flowing water, like whispers trying to shake him awake. The soft wind gently caressed his cheeks, leaving the nostalgic scent of sunlight in its wake. Roland gradually realized he was somewhere very comfortable indeed. Heaven? This feels nice. How long it had been since he was so peaceful? At least long enough that he'd forgotten the sensation. Yes, since 4 years ago, when Germany had invaded France, reaching Paris in a mere month and bringing the country to surrender. They had controlled this country for 4 full years. Memories of how he'd fled Paris with his friend Olivier, and the countless battlefields they'd been on since crossed his mind's eye like a slideshow. Those very memories dragged Roland's consciousness out of its dreamlike state. Oh. Is it our heroine? He somehow managed to lift his eyelids, heavy as they were, with the sun shining down upon them. He almost had to wonder how long he'd been asleep, because despite the light not being all that intense, his retinas burned in pain, forcing him to blink repeatedly. Once his eyes got used to the stimulus, he opened them wide. Find a different pair of eyes, blue like a cloudless azure sky, looking down upon him. That's a cool necklace. How'd you do that? The girl smiled, her frame lit by the soft sunlight at her back. It shone through her bright blonde hair, sparkling like a faint rainbow. Who are you, and where is this? Where am I? Roland moved his lips hesitantly as he struggled to make sense of the situation, his consciousness still faint. But as the back of his throat and tongue were stiff, his voice wouldn't come out the way he wanted. Oh, thank God. Prompted by the girl's words, Roland turned his gaze, and a spring full of clear water amidst an overgrown grove crossed its vision. The trees were surrounded by fog, which rendered it impossible to look too far beyond. If I catch a cold, it's the best thing that's happened to me. Hurt? The question made him realize at last that he was feeling no pain whatsoever. Back then, I definitely... The scene resurfaced suddenly in his mind, a dark full moon under a crimson canopy. A group of shadowy cavaliers appearing from the fog, led by a female knight. Olivia rushing at her, and the sword swinging down. That's right, that number, she cut my neck open. Am I still alive? After all that happened, I can't feel any pain at all? What's going on here? The sword must have been terribly sharp, because he didn't feel any pain the moment it cut him, and perhaps it hadn't started to hurt since then. It was because he was under the influence of anesthesia, or something of the sort. Except the girl before him didn't look like a medic or a nurse, and this didn't look like a field hospital. What's more, I was found unconscious in the spring? What's going on here? With his confused mind only being able to piece together jumbled fragments of information, he could not come up with an answer. What on earth happened? Roland dreadfully pressed his hands against his neck, examining the flesh which had been cut open by the female knight. That's impossible. I'm not cut anywhere? His fingertips couldn't feel a cut or a gash. He fumbled over and over again, but he couldn't find so much as a blood clot. I definitely remember someone cut my throat wide open. The ghastly image of the blood spraying out of his body like a fountain surfaced vividly in his mind. After losing so much blood, it would be impossible to not leave a scar, at least a blood stain. Was that a dream then? The more I thought about it, the more reasonable that explanation seemed. Almost 30 minutes in. Oh, goodness. The girl furrowed her brows anxiously as she looked at Roland's dumbfounded expression. No, nothing hurts. It's fine. It's just the situation he was in so incomprehensible that he did not explain it, so he just simply fell silent. He couldn't tell which of his memories were real, but since he had wound up in this unfamiliar forest, he assumed he had at least managed to escape the crashing plane. Perhaps after landing, he lost sight of Olivier, wandered the forest alone, and finally found his way to the spring, where he passed out from exhaustion. He filled the holes in the story with such conjectures, eventually coming up with an explanation that seemed to make sense. But in that case, what happened to Olivier? Say, miss, did you find me here alone? Was there someone else passed out nearby? Roland's throat and tongue had finally loosened, enabling him to speak without much difficulty. I see. Alright then, thank you. I wonder, where is he, and what is he doing right now? Roland suddenly became awfully concerned for his friend. After confirming his own location, he figured he would simply go out and search for his friend, but just as he resolved to do so... Thank you. The girl suddenly smiled widely, like the petals of a flower blossoming from the morning dew. Like this? It was then that Roland became aware of the position he was in, and of the true identity of the soft sensation his head had been resting against. Ah! How could he have not noticed it upon waking up? His head was resting upon his young woman's lap. This young woman's lap. But his thoughts had been so muddled that he hadn't noticed. But pardon me. In a panic, Roland tried to scramble to his feet, but his still rigid body couldn't manage to follow his demands. The girl's face was close enough that he couldn't move too carelessly lest the two of them bump heads. Oh, how should I put this? Having that question asked so directly made him feel all the more awkward. Anyway, can I get up now? His body finally doing what it was told, Roland rolled away from the girl's lap onto the grass. Averting his face so as to hide his blushing, he coughed dry in an attempt to dispel his awkwardness as he slowly got to his feet. From the corner of his eye, he could feel the girl's puzzled gaze directly right at him. It's a good thing Olivier isn't around. His friend's absence was, at least for this one moment, something Roland was deeply thankful for. He wouldn't let me hear the end of it as long as I lived. Taking deep breaths, Roland gradually regained his bearings and returned his gaze to the girl. Noticing that she was still sitting on the grass, Roland offered her a hand. She didn't seem to understand the meaning of what he was doing and simply blinked in bafflement. Well, can I help you to your feet, miss? Realizing how theatrical that must have sounded, Roland grew embarrassed again. Olivier definitely would have kept his composure at a time like this. The girl finally seemed to realize his intentions. Her small hand grabbing onto his as she pulled herself to her feet. She's so light. Rowan was shocked at the weight tugging on his hand, which felt as light as a feather, and how soft her fingers felt as well. Ever since he volunteered to join the army, he'd hardly had any chance to touch a woman. His grip had grown used to the heavy weight of a gun and the cold touch of a knife. Perhaps things were different for a man about town like Olivier, who had used every leave to visit London, but... It was as though the girl's carefree smile blew away the sediment that had built up at the bottom of Roland's heart after years of fighting. I'm the one who should be grateful. Thank you for looking after a stranger like me. There was no affection or exaggeration in those words. He smiled from the bottom of his heart. Isn't she a cutie? Roland found himself finally managing to get a good look at the girl. He wondered if she was local. She was dressed in something a bit unusual, but spoke in French. Roland didn't think he had heard a bit of Lorraine accent in her words, however. That is not French, but we'll pretend it is. Humble as her words were, she spoke them all too naturally. It seemed as though she honestly felt that way. That's not true. If you hadn't pulled me out of the spring, I could have well drowned in there. I owe you my life. The girl said earlier he had been unconscious while submerged in the spring, but his clothes were dry enough that he didn't feel that way. Having heard it mentioned again made Roland all the more aware of that fact. Could it be that I've been unconscious for a long while now? Been a few hours. That long? Roland was struck speechless and felt a cold sweat run down his body. He hurriedly rummaged through his uniform and pulled out his pocket watch. It was a watch for military use, one with 24 display, but the hands were stopped on June 6th, the day of the operation, at just after 0200 hours. 2 a.m. Did the shock from the descent break it, or was it because I was submerged in the water? He tried winding it, but the hands wouldn't move. Roland gave up, letting out a sigh. If he was to believe her words, it was nearly sunset. The landing had long since started, and his army was probably already engaged with the occupational forces, and under heavy bombardment to boot. If all was well, they would have already secured a beachhead, but there was also a chance that they hadn't yet found a good landing point. At any rate, I have to reunite my allies as soon as I can. With their transport reduced to that state, their unit was unlikely incapable of achieving its initial objective. Roland frankly wasn't sure if there were even any other survivors except for him and Olivier. But if the two of them could regroup with the main force, they might be of help somehow. He didn't return to his homeland for the first time in 4 years to doze leisurely in some forest. Olivier, who had also landed successfully, should be somewhere nearby. He'd have to regroup with him as soon as possible. And to do that, I'll have to find my way out of this forest first. Roland returned his gaze to the girl, hoping to ask her for the way out, but she seemed to be eyeing his hands, her eyes positively glittering with curiosity. Something the matter, miss? Amulet? You mean my clock? Yeah, like tower-sized. Clock can be this small. Don't lie to me. No, I think you could find clocks this big just about anywhere. You've never seen a watch before? The girl laughed happily as she curiously examined the watch Roland handed her. She'd never really seen a pocket watch before. Roland had to wonder what kind of life she'd been leading up till now. Beg your pardon? Oh, it's probably because of his armband. It looks like a cross. Struck with this question that seemingly came out straight out of the blue, Roland could only blink in amazement. Seeing Roland at a loss for words, the girl asked again, this time pointing at the double cross on his uniform sleeve. Yeah, this is the new religion, the hipper religion. It's called Jesus 2. As she spoke, the girl took the rosario she was wearing in hand and turned an enthusiastic glance in Roland's direction. Oh. called the Cross of Lorraine. It's the symbol of the Saint Jeanne d'Arc and also the insignia of the Free French Army. You're not a clergyman or anything. Cutting Roland off, confused words slipped from the girl's lips. Her face, which had been bright as the sun so far, suddenly clouded over. Unaware of the reason for the girl's confusion, Roland decided to pick his words carefully. Did I say anything to offend you? The girl shook her head and smiled back at Roland. Despite her claims, her smile felt a bit frail. Jeanne d'Arc is one of the patron saints of France. How do you not know that? Well, they're certainly patron saints of France, but Jeanne d'Arc was only canonized as a saint in 1920, just a quarter of a century ago, shortly after her beatification in 1909. She was venerated as a symbol of national pride during the Great War, so much so that many churches in her name were established one after another across France. Since then, Jeanne d'Arc has been recognized by the populace as the primary patron saint of France, and her name was treated with great reverence. Roland didn't think it possible for a French person to not know who she was. She'd never seen a pocket watch, and she doesn't know the Saint Jeanne d'Arc. The mysterious girl. Roland was very curious as to how she'd been living up to this point. Same name. The clouded expression that overtook her face earlier having completely vanished, she turned a radiant smile toward him. Oh, right, my apologies. It slipped my mind. Realizing that he neglected to share his name with the girl who saved his life, Roland was filled with shame. My name is Roland. Pleasure to meet you, Jeanne. The girl grinned with a carefree smile. When his name left the girl's lips, both her voice and her smile filled him with a wave of nostalgia, loneliness, and other such bittersweet emotions. Jeanne, have we met before by any chance? The words escaped Roland's lips before he even knew it. Realizing a moment too late what he just said, Roland felt his face heat up. What am I saying? This is no different from Oliver's attempts at picking up ladies. I'm sorry, forget I asked that. Of course, it's obvious that's impossible. The girl chuckled. Roland felt something significant from her honest smile. Anyway, once again, it's a pleasure to meet you, Jeanne. That was the moment of the first meeting. Would it be the last? No. Well, it looks like our boy has gone back in time, maybe? I'm not quite sure. It doesn't make much sense, right? But yeah, that's Jeanne at the Clocktower. Check it out right now on Steam, mangamer.com. It's $39.99 if you want it. It's completely uncensored on both platforms. So yeah, if you liked the video, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more visual novel goodness. I'll see you all next time, and have a good day.